Very often, Neo-Baroque is described as a current of taste in society between the 19th and 20th centuries that falsifies Baroque forms while waiting to find its own esprit nouveau. Gillo Dorfles, in an essay published in 1951, was one of the first to find analogies and derivations of the Baroque age in contemporary architecture, not only on a formal level, but above all on a spiritual one. These intuitions have been accompanied over the years by a rehabilitation of the historical value of Baroque architecture. The moment we realize that chaos is not only the prerogative of infinite space, but also of the inner universe of each of us, the Neo-Baroque is born. It's an aesthetic wave in artistic, literary, philosophical, and mass media production with a behavior oriented towards fragmentariness, instability, and the fascination of complexity. What I intend to propose here is an attempt to investigate the chaotic complexity of the phenomenon by providing not an overall image, but a particular point of view that is capable of producing connecting signs between the Baroque era and today's world. In architecture, the use of metaphor is the fil rouge that allows us to understand how Baroque form has been transformed into a neo-Baroque formula, which has produced today those same fantastic fabrications that in 17th century treatises are called flowers. The flower is the metaphor chosen by the literati to represent the Baroque era in its entirety. This is not just a linguistic game, considering that there was a real fashion that involved the whole of 17th century society. Stimulated by the invasion of exotic plants from America and the Orient, the European world proposed the flower garden as a new type of exhibition typology, supported by specialist literature. The flower thus becomes the epicenter and pretext for innumerable linguistic artifices. From botanists to scientific illustrators, all the arts feed on this metaphor. Architects of the caliber of Cosimo Fanzago and Giuseppe Zimbalo display all their originality in the decorative fluorescence of their architectural works, visually translating the Counter-Reformation doctrine permeated with botanical symbols and floral references in the orations and in the sermons. It can certainly be said that the Baroque man, both in the sacred and in the profane spheres, identifies himself with a peregrine flower. If the Baroque intellectual celebrated the beauty of the flower, the Neo-Baroque architect understands that before seeing a flower blossom, a copious fluid of labor is required. It may well be said that the season of intense flowering began precisely in 1980, when Paolo Portoghesi inaugurated the Strada Novissima from which to start again. It is not possible to understand Portuguese architecture if one does not perceive the weight he attaches to the Baroque tradition that is a constant presence in his project. Just think of the recurring motif in Borromini's masterpiece, The Church of Sant'Ivo alla Sapienza in Rome. Everything revolves around star symbolism, from the plan to the dome to the ornamentation. In Portughese's research, in Sant'Ivo, the star dome is compared to a Germanic iris due to the compositional affinity of the forms. Over time, the star motif became recurrent in the architect works until it was masterfully repeated, for example, in the Church of St. Cornelius and Cyprian in Calcutta. If the beauty of lotus flowers immersed in water inspired the winning design of an international competition for a new jetty of the Phrygian waterfront, the Germanier inspired the design for a car park along Rome's Eastern Ring Road. The design for a mega store, on the other hand, is a gerbera with enormous petals, while there is no shortage of studies on the theme of the rose, understood as a turbine of petals. The breathing tower in Shanghai calls about the dualism of life in a living but still immature bud. The upward-facing, not yet blossomed lily of an office tower in Treviso belongs to the same category. The compositional research of Portoghese is nourished by folds of matter that internalize the Baroque lesson and reflect the secret that Gilles Deleuze discovered in the same years, that of the folds of the soul. The philosopher affirms that there seems to be a long Baroque line that passes through the fold, bringing together architects, painters, musicians, poets. If the Baroque, in the words of Deleuze, continually produces folds by inventing the infinite operation of stretching, distending, the Neo-Baroque architect does not have to ask himself the problem of how to finish the fold, but how to take it to infinity. Frank Gehry is one of those protagonists who internalize postmodern teaching of Paolo Portoghese. The Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris in 2014 was described as a cathedral of light, as a fish, a cloud, a sailboat, or simply a snow white flower blossoming in the park. Gehry was enthusiastic about the multitude of suggestions, stating that the aim was to create an architecture that would internalize all kinds of metaphors of ephemerality and fluidity. The same chromatic dynamic resonates in the Martha Museum in Erfurt, East Westphalia, Germany. The undulating dynamic of the external forms is much more than a compositional choice. We are faced with a neo-Baroque ligament that expresses concern for the environment, a founding characteristic of the museum, also expressed in the acronym MARTA, through the undulating roof landscape that reflects the adjacent course of the river AA. The same curves which, taken individually, are the rivulets of water of the river, joined together by compositional links, represent the petals of an enormous shining flower, visible in the landscape, thanks to the stainless steel, the material of which the roof of the entire building is made. The Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, on the other hand, is the most striking example demonstrating Gehry's ability to make a real urban node bloom. The visitor arrives at the building from the main road running through Bilbao, only to lose himself in its titanium-covered structure with no flat surfaces. It is precisely a flower that the visitor sees when, inside the large atrium, he turns his gaze upwards. The same neo-Baroque flower that is realized when looking down from above, fold after fold, thanks to the twisting of the facades, one on top of the other. Observing other works by Gehry, it is possible to think that, after all, Bruno Taut's utopia is not so unrealizable, and that architecture can flourish in a natural way. Gehry's flowers leads the visitor to interface with his own notes, passing through a hostile, decomposed, and closed environment. It is only by looking at the building from above and from afar that one perceives instead that the architect has made a piece of the city flourish. The metaphor of the flower makes one realize that neo-Baroque is not a mere citation practice, but a state of survival. moving the definition of the phenomenon away from a generic revival tendency, it is necessary to focus attention on that precise spiritual affinity with the Baroque that was definitively triggered in the 1980s, when the rediscovery of Baroque culture in poetry, philosophy, architecture had an explosion that traveled in parallel with the renewed enthusiasm for historical citation. Today, the aim of intellectuals, whether physicists or architects, is the same: to study and propose connecting links between complex and apparently closed components. Exactly what in the 17th century were ligaments, points, sharpnesses, all attempts to associate opposing elements like stranger among citizens. Since it is therefore an aesthetic process, in today's architecture the flowers can be only grasped by looking from above and from afar, the fruit of a perspective that invests not only the technique, but above all the metaphors used by the architect to best render the precarious equilibrium that is before our eyes. As Deleuze philosophy teaches us, in our own small way, we believe we are made of conflicts. It is only when we learn to know our faults, to live fold by fold, to transform insecurities into strength, that is possible to make our innermost essence bloom. And it is thus, by following the faults, that architects build flowers. Thank you for your attention.